All right. Well, thank you, Micah. Thank you to our first panel. We are going to keep rolling now into the first of two of our featured addresses here today. We'll have a break after this for lunch, but now we're going to keep the program going, and I have the honor of introducing Senator Mike Lee. Senator Mike Lee of Utah was first elected in 2010, and he has spent his career defending the fundamental liberties of all Americans and advocating for America's founding constitutional principles. Senator Lee graduated from Brigham Young University with a degree in political science and from BYU's law school in 1997. He then went on to serve as law clerk with future Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit. Throughout his career, Senator Lee has earned a reputation as an outstanding practitioner of the law based on his sound judgment, abilities in the courtroom, and thorough understanding of the Constitution. Senator Lee serves as the ranking Republican on the Judiciary Subcommittee on Antitrust, Competition Policy, and Consumer Rights, in addition to serving on the Energy and Natural Resources Subcommittee on Public Lands, Forests, and Mining, and the Committee on the Budget. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, we at the American Conservative have long admired Senator Lee's principled stand for constitutional foreign policy, and we're honored to have him join us here today. Please join me in welcoming Senator Mike Lee.
Thank you. It's great to be with you. And it's always welcoming when I come into a room like this and I can see the backdrop, the American Conservative. You know, you ever have that dream when you were in high school or college that you show up for school either not fully clothed or even worse, you show up for finals and all of a sudden you realize that you hadn't studied for that class for an entire semester and then you wake up in a cold sweat. That's the dream that I have today. That's the variation of that, is I show up to one of these and start giving a speech only to look back and discover that I'm speaking at a group called the American Progressive. That wouldn't be fun. It would be different. I just came over from voting. My wife Sharon sometimes jokes that whenever she comes with me to Washington, as soon as we step off the plane at DCA, she said that I walk much faster as soon as we land here than we do in Utah. It's because we're constantly going back and forth between votes. And that happens sometimes. And it also describes the speed with which we sometimes get involved in conflicts. And it's to that weakness that I wish to direct many of my remarks today. I want to thank the American Conservative for hosting this event and for all of you for being here. It's good for conservatives to get together and talk about what it means to be a conservative, what it is that we're conserving, why it is that the things that we're trying to conserve need to be conserved, and what the risks are for not conserving them. The questions that arise regarding America's role in the world have always been beset by tension from the very founding of our republic, and appropriately so. These should be things that we wrestle with, because they're not easy. And when we try to pretend that they're easy, when we try to force the concept of their being easy, we make other things hard, much harder than they should be. I think John Quincy Adams captured it quite well in his famous speech given nearly 202 years ago, just a few hundred yards from here in the Capitol. America, he said, quote, goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. America is, quote, a well-wisher to the freedom and independence of all, but remains the champion and vindicator only of her own, close quote. The same tension bedevils us now. Not quite to the same degree that it should, but it does. It's still here. In fact, it's a tension that needs to be embraced. It needs to be rekindled from time to time. It needs to be reawakened. And we need to be asking these difficult questions, like how best do we secure American sovereignty while exemplifying liberty abroad? How do we unite ourselves with freedom, ideally at a hegemonic scale, without taking on the burden of empire? Now, neoconservatives have one approach. They would have us believe that the answer to this tension is a foreign policy that necessarily places America at the tip of every spear and leverages American sweat, blood, tears, and treasure for an ever-expanding, always morphing definition of what's in our national interest. Liberal internationalists, meanwhile, take a slightly different approach. They maintain that it's the international community of global elites who should define when, where, and how, and to what extent America uses its power. Then you've got the isolationists who embrace a foreign policy that tends to sort of shrug at geopolitics, at international affairs generally, believing instead that domestic tranquility will be secured if we just leave well enough alone. I don't fit neatly into any of these categories. And instead, I categorize myself as something else, as a constitutional realist. Constitutional realist, you see, of which I consider myself one, see foreign policy first through the lens of our constitutional duty. And second, we undertake that first task with a sober vision of the world informed by history, especially our own history. We see the answer to this tension as one that can be answered only with a measured and fact-based assessment of the national interest, while respecting the clearly defined roles of both Congress and the presidency in the context of American foreign policy. This might sound natural, it might sound obvious, and yet these are the things that have been most neglected. We often neglect the constitutional question altogether, and even when neglecting the constitutional question, we don't always evaluate the prudential question appropriately, taking into account the due consideration of our history, including our recent history. So America can't simply fall into the practice of ignoring the rest of the world. If ever there had been a time in the past where we could have done that, that time has long since passed us. But our engagement, particularly our commitment of treasure and the precious blood of America's sons and daughters, must come only when the highest, most stringent, most analytical threshold has been met and fully satisfied. And a decision of this scale should be made on the record with full acknowledgement of the stakes involved. And this decision-making, this evaluation, this analysis must be undertaken only by individuals who are accountable to the people, from the president to Congress, but especially Congress, the branch of the federal government most accountable to the people at the most regular intervals. There's a good reason for this. You see, Congress, the people's branch, is too often ignored or it refuses to participate in the decision-making process. And it's inevitably to our own detriment when this happens. The defining feature of self-government in any society is that the system of self-government is supposed to involve the people, always acting through their elected representatives. This is a significant feature, particularly when it comes to foreign policy and war making, a significant feature that differentiates our system from that of our predecessor government, the one based in London. In our London-based national government, the one we had before we had this system, one person, the chief executive, could and did make the decision to take us to war. That led to some problems. The king would say, let's go fight. It was Parliament's job to figure out how to fund it. And so as a result of that, kings, it turns out, are not subject to popular will. Little known fact, sad but true. A king could take the people to war only later to lead to the people suffering. And so in Federalist 69, Alexander Hamilton acknowledged this distinction as an important one, and one that we shouldn't forget, as something that differentiated our system of government from that of our predecessor government. They wanted to be in a country in which the decision to take us to war could be made only by the branch of government most accountable to the people at the most regular intervals. But our modern foreign policy has not exactly respected this tradition or this acknowledgement of this distinction, this constitutional separation of power, this constitutional channeling of the war-making authority to make sure that we can't go into war for light or transient reasons, nor can we or should we or must we ever go to war due to the decision of a single individual. You see, today, we've drifted from this understanding to the point that a relatively small group of self-appointed experts will often anoint themselves kings and queens and make life-altering decisions for the country, more or less without any direct accountability to the people, because these tend to be people who are not elected, with the exception of the president, whom they are almost inevitably advising. Now, we'll affectionately or not so affectionately refer to this group of people collectively as the blob. And the problem with the blob, other than it being inherently undemocratic, not to mention unsightly, is that those who comprise the blob are constantly, consistently, badly wrong. The blob told us, for example, that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, that Kabul wouldn't fall. The blob also told us that sanctions would rapidly cripple Russia, that arming Syrian rebels would never benefit al-Qaeda, that we would save democracy in Libya, and that the surge that we initiated, and then the next surge, and then the next surge, and surge after surge after surge in Afghanistan would lead to decisive and final victory. Now, sure, I get it. No one can predict the future with absolute certainty, and I don't expect perfection of anyone. I don't expect prescience or omniscience of any government, and any government or government actor who claims such abilities is met with my suspicion. Sometimes the decisions that we make will be wrong. As best as we try to inform ourselves of the facts at hand, sometimes we're going to get things wrong. And I understand that. That's a condition of mortality, of being a human being. But when the same group of people is wrong over and over and over again, maybe the small room in which these decisions are made should be a little bit bigger. Maybe, just maybe at that point, we should remember the document to which every person who serves in the Senate or the House of Representatives or whoever occupies the White House has sworn an oath to uphold and protect and defend. Maybe, just maybe, the room should be bigger because the room is not on Pennsylvania Avenue. It's right here, right across the street. And it consists of two rooms, the House and the Senate. Maybe these decisions should also be subject to debate, discussion, and ultimately approval by Congress, as the Constitution requires. It's not just because the Constitution requires this that's a good thing. The fact that they put it in there is the very reason why we need to do it. The necessities will result in this debate and discussion. And this allows these ideas to be tested and defended or not defended in the light of day, and where representatives can cast their votes, and then, importantly, bear accountability for the outcomes, rather than always being able to point to some amorphous blob on which they will cast blame, to the extent blame is even cast at all. There exists exceedingly limited scenarios, specifically those involving a direct attack on the United States, wherein the commander-in-chief might be compelled to take immediate action. However, even in those circumstances, the president is constitutionally prohibited from engaging in war without the approval of Congress. See, there's a difference between responding to repelling an immediate attack on the one hand and engaging in war on the other. The fact that it can be sometimes be perceived as a difficult line-drawing exercise doesn't mean you don't need to go through the exercise at all. It doesn't mean that the difficulty authorizes us to ignore the imperative. It's vital to recognize the difference between responding to a direct attack on the one hand and deploying American forces into undeclared wars on the other hand. But it should be the rule rather than the exception that when American blood and treasure are committed year after year after year, the People's Branch should determine whether we have war or peace. In other words, given that we know that this is the ultimate outcome, that the outcome when we get involved in wars, It's almost never a short-term, limited duration conflict. It requires a lot of money and a lot of blood, a lot of personnel, year after year after year. It seems to me not to be too big of a hassle to do it the right way constitutionally and the right way that results in accountability to the American people. Earlier this year, when the Senate debated and ultimately passed the legislation dealing with the 1991 and 2002 authorizations for the use of military force, repealing both of those measures, I offered an amendment that would make future authorizations to employ military force subject to recurring approval by Congress. There are reasons I did this, reasons that have to do with our chronic neglect and decision to ignore the Constitution, and reasons that have everything to do with the fact that when the war in Afghanistan started, my daughter Eliza was an infant, just a few months old. She's now married. The fact that we can go more than 2 decades in a conflict without ever having Congress revisit it, to me suggested that it perhaps wouldn't be a bad idea to require these things to sunset every couple of years, and thereby allow for recurring accountability for those who were serving in Congress at the time. The idea is to revive this sense of accountability in our foreign policy, something that's been missing for far too long. For the people we represent who have to live under these circumstances, they need to have a voice in the process, and this is the best way to do that. Now, the amendment, perhaps as one might have expected, it failed. It failed by a vote of 19 to 76. The prevailing sentiment in Washington is still that the blob calls the shots and that the options for the rest of us to fall in line, or at least not to disagree with the public, are somewhat limited. Now, you can see this dynamic that I'm describing fairly clearly in the debate, or better said, in the relative lack of debate regarding U.S. involvement in the war in Ukraine. Debate on this question is not tolerated. And that's made clear day after day. Not even in the legacy media, the place where opinions are supposed to be debated, and the place where in decades past, anti-war sentiments had a place. Not even anti-war sentiments, at least sentiments raising legitimate questions about war. None of this is tolerated, even in, especially in, the legacy media. I say legacy media because it seems one of the only places where you can see some discussion happening on this, and you see it in great abundance, is on social media. Fortunately for all, social media always has tempered, non-inflammatory discussions, as it's been known to nurture. Now, look, I want to be very clear about something. Reasonable minds can and do disagree on whether the continued commitment of financial assistance and weapons assistance is in our national interest, in the interest of the American people. But the problem I've got here is that anyone raising dissent, in fact, even anyone raising legitimate questions, is immediately labeled a Putin apologist, a lover of Russia. And I say that, I can speak with some authority here. I myself have fallen victim to that on many occasions. And more often than not, when I'm accused of that, it's just because I've asked some questions that need to be asked, questions that haven't been answered, but should be. Defaming your opponent in a debate is not a sign of the strength of your position. It's a sign of profound weakness. We all understand this intuitively. People who won't debate these questions without sinking into smears and motive questioning raise, quite appropriately, more questions than they provide answers. And the United States' role in the war in Ukraine should be debated. As I've stated, my lens as a constitutional realist is twofold. Assessing our national interest through the lens of prudence and the Constitution, that is, what our self-government requires, what our own system requires, what we've all taken an oath to uphold anyway, requires this. And the conflict in Ukraine needs to be justified on both of these metrics. But right now, it is not. It's not even really been attempted. First, there's the fact that our decisions to fund and arm Ukraine are not happening in a vacuum, and we've pretended in some ways as if they were. There are other emergent threats. China is engaging in a fair amount of saber rattling, more than usual, much more than usual. Our own national defense strategies in 2018 and 2020 flatly stated that the U.S. cannot engage in two major wars simultaneously. And yet we're depleting our stockpiles to support Ukraine. Our stockpiles, including stockpiles of a number of things that would be needed in both arenas should that other conflict become a hot one. This is leaving us ill-prepared to replenish those resources and prepare for what some would say might end up being the most significant near-term threat to our national interest and our national security abroad. Second, and relatedly, we're not the only country capable of acting in the Ukraine conflict on behalf of Ukraine, in support of Ukraine, and against Russia. Ukraine, of course, is not a NATO member, but it's adjacent to a number of our NATO allies. And this, in fact, is often used as perhaps the primary justification, the primary moral imperative for why we have to do it. And I get it. The theory is that if Ukraine were to fall, then all of a sudden you've got all these other NATO allies that we have in Europe, neighbors of Ukraine's, that would end up being threatened, and that could trigger our NATO Article 5 obligations and lead to all sorts of suffering and lead to a frightening empowerment of the evil megalomaniac that is Vladimir Putin. So yeah, I totally get that. But we have to remember something. Our European NATO allies have for decades, decade after decade, shirked their responsibility to prioritize their own defense. Their own defense spending commitments have not been met. They've been relying on U.S. security guarantees and U.S. defense spending that benefits the continent. You know, I think we provide roughly 70% of what's spent within NATO. We spend something in the neighborhood of around 4% of our GDP on defense. They've got a commitment to spend 2% on theirs, and they consistently, widely fail to meet that. Think about what this means. As my wife puts it, it's as though we've been funding Western European or European socialism through our defense spending, through NATO, for decades. And indeed, we have. You see, because we go over there, we provide for their defense. They're sitting there fat, dumb, and happy. I don't mean that literally. Just go with me on this one. They're in the catbird seat, we'll say. They feel confident that we're there to protect them. Their big ally, the United States, is spending an enormous amount of money over there so they don't have to. So they can go and spend money on other things. They can explore all the socialist reforms that they want to pursue in a way that wouldn't necessarily be possible if we weren't supplying so many of their security needs through our action there. So, look, I think it's high time that we put the burden of European security back on the shoulders of leaders in Brussels and London rather than in Washington. Until Western European capitals exceed 2% of GDP spent on defense, and I would add, until those same leaders also devote comparable shares of their GDP to this same conflict, the United States should not spend one penny more on Ukraine. This is no more our burden than it is theirs. They're making it all our burden, even though it's in their backyard, not ours. This isn't fair, especially when we've been carrying this burden for them for decades. This is wrong. We all know it's wrong. But by continuing to print more money and send it over there, we're guaranteeing that they won't do it. We're guaranteeing that if and when that awful moment comes, when our NATO Article 5 obligations are triggered, we show up and we're still fighting the battle overwhelmingly. This isn't okay. And it makes us less safe. It doesn't just impoverish us. It also makes us less safe. Look, this burden shifting is long overdue, and it really is time for Congress to assert this reality. So as we approach the upcoming NATO summit in Vilnius, Congress must pressure the Biden administration to revise the antiquated 2008 Wales defense spending pledge. The world has changed significantly, such that 2% of GDP spent on defense, which they're not meeting, but even if they were, one could argue that it no longer reflects the exigencies of the European environment. Third, and finally, our involvement in Ukraine is a proxy for our strategy toward Russia. But Russia, we have to remember, is not some trifling power. Scary, yes. Headed by a crazy mean guy, yes. But Russia, we have to remember, possesses nuclear weapons, a lot of nuclear weapons. More than that, Russia does not appear to be backing down, despite repeated insistence that if we did enough, if we spent enough over there during the early days, weeks, and months of the conflict, they would. But they don't appear to be backing down. Now, I don't think it's overstating anything to say that a standoff with a nuclear power, particularly this particular nuclear power, requires a considerable amount of prudence and judgment, not peacocking and popping off. We must act like it. These are just a few of the many strategic concerns that are associated with Ukraine. We should debate them before we deliberate on sending more aid, which the Senate will do later this year, in a supplemental spending bill. And by the way, this is significant here. I want to talk for a minute about the fact that they're planning to do this in a supplemental spending bill. That spending bill for Ukraine might well be attached to a bill to replenish the disaster relief fund. Now, remember, the disaster relief fund is not there for, it's not like OCO. It's not like the Overseas Contingency Operations Fund. No, this is domestic disaster relief fund. This is another sign of weakness in our unflinching pro-Ukraine strategy, one that aims to send as much money as possible, as we possibly can, to Ukraine. If your aid package cannot pass on its own merits, such that it has to be attached to another package, to a sympathetic must-pass bill, a bill that will be darn near impossible for senators and representatives of some states who either have recently been or expect soon to be imperiled by disasters. That says something about your cause. It says something about your failure to persuade people to support a particular cause. So rather than smearing their ideological opponents as anti-American or pro-Putin, perhaps the proponents of Ukraine aid should spend more time actually trying to convince people, trying to persuade the American people that it's worth the sacrifice that Americans are enduring and that they will continue to ask to endure if we continue down this path. And you see, it's not just this one, but so many of our discussions about foreign policy happen to take on this really ugly, myopic shade. Every conflict becomes a high-stakes negotiation about the future of the West. But constitutional realism demands that we see the whole field and that we try, insofar as we're capable, of seeing it and evaluating it dispassionately and prudently, cautiously, not always so eager to jump into a new conflict that we're unwilling and afraid to debate the merits of it with those who elected us. Like George Washington before him, John Quincy Adams was right. He was absolutely correct when he cautioned our very young nation to avoid frequent controversies, the causes of which are essentially foreign to our concerns. America is a little bit older now, but the sentiment is still spot on. A shrewd foreign policy is one marked by a clear-eyed and courageous assessment of America's national interest within the bound of our constitutional system of governance, which defers to the voters of the Republic rather than to an elite utopian vision of the world. This is our quest. This is our obligation. This is our duty, and this is our form of government. We can restore these dynamics, and restore them we must. Thank you.